So have you ever wondered about how to tell stories with data? Today I'm going to talk about using visualization to tell stories with data. Visualization is a new medium based upon computer graphics and interactive visual representations of data. My goal today is to show you how to use this medium to tell stories with data. But first, what is a good story? At Tableau, we're keenly interested in this question. We've been working with many people who tell stories using visualization technology, including some of the greatest data journalists on the planet. And what we've learned is that a good story has a story arc. It starts with a question or problem, it has a logical sequence or narrative, and it ends with a conclusion or resolution. And data stories in particular are often used to tell about a data finding. In this case, the logical sequence is often the steps, the operations that you go through the data that leads to a conclusion. And the value of a data story is that not only does it tell you about the data, but it tells you why the data is important. And as I look out in this room, I believe that we're all data storytellers. You don't have to be a data journalist to tell a good story with data. I hope you'll leave today feeling both informed and inspired. Informed by the examples I'm going to show you, both good and bad, and inspired by the magic that can occur when you combine visualization with a good story arc. I'm going to start by telling you a story from before the time there were computers. This story was told in London in the 1850s by a Dr. John Snow. He was dealing with a cholera epidemic, and Dr. Snow was a very skilled data journalist. And what he did is he plotted the cases of cholera on this map that you see here and learned that they were clustering around Broad Street, which you can see in the center of the map. The little black rectangles on the map are the individual cases of cholera. And being a very skilled data journalist, he looked both at the cases around Broad Street and at the cases distant from Broad Street. And what he found was that the cases distant from Broad Street all had a connection to that part of town. It turns out on Broad Street there's a water pump, and the people distant were drinking from that water pump. And he also looked close to Broad Street where there weren't any cases of cholera. There was a brewery. I think you can see it on the map. There's a rectangle there where absolutely nobody got sick because, of course, they were all drinking beer rather than the water. So he concluded at this point that there was something about the water coming out of that pump that was making people sick. And this was before he had learned about the germ theory of disease, so this is a significant data finding. And he wanted to get the handle from the pump removed, and so he needed to convince the city fathers of that. And he told them the same story that I just told you, involving the same data. And the conclusion of the story was that they actually removed the handle from the pump, and then the cholera epidemic subsided. So this is an example of a data story that actually saved lives. And yes, you can save lives with data. Now, I'd like to believe that if Dr. Snow had been alive today and telling this story, he would have used visualization technology to do it. I'm pretty confident he would have. So what is visualization technology? Well, what you see on the screen here is a definition that was used in a book that was published in 1999 when we were really getting started with visualization. So it's the computer-supported interactive visual representation of abstract data in order to amplify cognition. At this time, what we were focusing on was the use of computer graphics for discovery with data. And these ideas led to the dissertation that ended up being part of Tableau. But since then, what we've found is that visualization can also be used to really effectively tell stories with data. And as I said before, we've been working with some of the greatest data journalists on the planet. Journalists at the Sydney Morning Herald, at the Nieuwsblad, and one of the greatest storytelling newspapers on the planet, The Guardian. And what we've learned working with these people is that there are 3 places where visualization can help with telling stories with data. You can use visualization to find the story. Very important. You have to find a story to tell a good one. Then you can use visualization to tell the story. And then, as I said at the beginning, this is a new medium. It's a medium where the story itself is interactive, and it becomes a place where people can explore and find their own stories in the data. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to step through some examples from the data journalists, and we'll learn a little bit. What I'll be doing is describing sort of the process we went through in trying to understand more about storytelling with data. So let me start with find, and I wanted to start with an example. This is a recent example from The Guardian, and I know it's a little faint for the people in the back, but what you see on the left is a map of the UK, and on the right-hand side is both a bar chart and a line chart down at the bottom. And this is an interactive story. What I've done here is I've recorded these examples. I didn't want to be dependent on lots of different newspapers having their websites up. And so what you're going to see is a little video of me playing around with this one. And this is an example of a very typical thing you might find on a blog or a newspaper website. It's a place to go explore. And frankly, I don't live here, but I actually found this pretty interesting to explore with. And so if I go down here and start the video, basically what you can do is bring the mouse out, and it'll respond to hover events as you move the mouse around. So in a moment, you'll see that I bring the mouse in. It's live, and as I can move the mouse around, what you're seeing here is both the inward and outward migration from the particular selected county that we're starting with. Actually, I'm not really well on the network, so I probably shouldn't have tried what I tried to do. But as you can see, as you move around, particularly the trend line in the lower right-hand corner, there's some very interesting trends over time, depending on what county you're in terms of both the inward and outward migration. And it gets really fascinating. I suspect, particularly if you know the area well, you could probably go and explore here and find out all sorts of interesting things. So that's an example. There's nothing particular in that example about an arc, a story arc at all, but it's a very interesting place to explore, and you could probably even find a story in that. And so what I'm going to try here, just briefly, is to restart my slideshow and hope that that fixes the problem I had. The second example is one from the Washington Post. Here you see data which is about the relationship between how many years you have healthy life and your total lifespan. And so on the horizontal here is the percentage of healthy years, and on the vertical here is the lifespan. And the dots in this view represent different countries. And this particular view starts to move a little bit more towards telling a story because it has some annotations here. So like, for example, this annotation here shows where United States fits in terms of the overall cloud of points. China over here is a significant outlier. They have a higher percentage of healthy years compared to their lifespan than most of the other countries. And then down here, this is men in 2010. Up in the corner is the selection. There was a big earthquake in Haiti, and so it was a significant outlier downward in terms of lifespan at that time because had been a big earthquake just before this data was collected. The next example is an example about pay gap, gender gap between men and women. On the horizontal, you see here men median weekly wage earning, and on the vertical, you see women's. The dark line, diagonal line you see would represent equality between men and women. And the points that you see plotted here are different occupations. This is United States data. And as you can see, there's a huge inequality in terms of men getting paid more than women. The faint lines that you see represent percentage off of equality for them. On the left-hand side is a trend line, which actually has a story visible on the screen right now, which is you can see that this gap has been getting smaller over the period of time. And the interesting thing about this is that there's also here at the top is different occupations you can click through. And now we'll find out if I have live video here. Oh, live video. Yay. So you can see you can roll over an individual point here, and you can see that postal service clerks are paid equally between men and women. And you can also go click up here. This is entertainment, education, and law. That's the particular category. And here there's an annotation that pops up and tells you male tenured professors get paid, what, 20% better than female tenured professors. And you can go see the specific details about that. And so as you work your way down through these occupations, it has somewhat of the feel of a story arc, but it isn't really. This is really a place about exploring data. And it's these sorts of views that are the most common ones that you'll see out there when people are sharing data on the web. And so you can see here, this is, what are we on? Production and transportation, and they're very low paid, but it's still, the men are paid more than women's. And it's the service sector where the postal clerks and whatnot, where it's equal and balanced. So those are 3 examples of using visualization to explore. And of course, Tableau desktop itself is a tool for using visualization to explore. Now I want to talk about is telling stories using visualization. And I'm going to start, interestingly enough, with a story that has no interactivity at all. It really is based upon computer graphics and a particular technique that's called connected scatter plots. This is a story about automobile safety. And what you see on the horizontal here, on the horizontal axis, is the increased amount of driving over time from left to right. And on the vertical axis, this is about fatalities. As you go up, more people dying over time. And what the line is, in a connected scatter plot, the line typically represents the change in time over from one point to the next. And so overall, when you look at this data overall, there's a movement over time from the upper left quadrant down to the lower right quadrant. And there's, as you can see, using the computer graphics, a lot of very nice annotations, and the text of the story has been woven into this visualization to be able to tell an effective story. I'm going to zoom into parts of it. So if we start in the upper left, you can see that this is in the 50s and early 60s. Cars were starting to get faster. The caption says muscle cars. And as they got faster, there started to be an increase in the number of fatalities that were happening because they were driving faster. There was also an increase in how far people on the average were driving, which is why the line moves to the right a little bit. By the 60s, the cars had gotten significantly faster and fatalities rose up really high, to the point that in the States, there was significant concern about this. Ralph Nader wrote a book about this, which then caused there to be political will to do something about it, and legislation came in that they started trying to make the cars safer. And then, as you can see on the right-hand edge of this focused part, there's this drop again once the car safety started being legislated. And then the next 2 parts here is both the energy crisis and continual emphasis on safety, seat belts, and sobriety. The little loop is very interesting. That was when the energy crisis happened. And what happened there is the line actually goes backwards because during that time, people drove less. And so that's why the loop's backwards. But then ultimately, as cars got more energy efficient, then they started driving more again. And then it continues on downward to the bottom. And you'll have to read the text, but the actual sort of the point of the story is we've had this huge success with government involvement involved in automobile safety. And the concern of the author is that we'll start relaxing those rules, and then there's a little arrow pointing up, and then we will probably see the fatalities going up again. So this, as you can see, this is an example of there being a significant story arc, even in a static visualization. But with visualization, we can also create interactive stories that have a story arc along these lines. So when I looked at this and thought about it, I realized that for data stories in particular, one of the things you need to do as a storyteller is explain those operations that lead to whatever conclusion and data finding you have. And if you're a data analyst, you know these sorts of operations. You want to be able to compare measures. You want to normalize measures, because that's absolutely essential to tell good stories. You might filter down to a particular part, or you might drill down, or you might sort. There's a whole bunch of different operations that you need to do. And we can use computer graphics and interactive techniques to explain to people that have no data savvy at all how the data is being transformed in this way. And there's huge power in here, and I have a few examples to show you. The first one is actually a relatively old example. In 2007, there was a big climate change conference in Copenhagen. And this particular viz was published just before that conference. And it is actually very illustrative of how you can use techniques like this to understand data transformations. And so it starts off with just an overall map here of the global emissions for the different countries in 2007, where you can see highlighted the big circle there is the United States. And then as I play the video, you'll see that I'm going to what the story does is that it steps through different chapters in the story and takes you through the argument of it. So let me fire this up. And the first thing I'll do is I'll show you that you can get a tooltip and shows that 6 billion metric tons of emissions from the United States, which is, a lot. And then we can go over here and look at the UK, only 500 million, so a lot less. And then finally, although it's gray here, China is also at 6 billion. So this is sort of a warm-up view to get you started. Up at the top are the chapters that you can go through, and a convenient next button, so you can click through from one view to the next. So when you click next here, you get the trend view. So here's trend over time for China, United States, Europe, and India. And the big point on this one is that China has just crossed United States before this climate change conference in terms of its global emissions. And so that's a relevant fact for what's going to be coming up at the conference. But it's only one point of view. You can normalize data to tell different points of view about it. And so here we've switched to emissions per capita. China is a very big country. And so per capita, its global emissions is very much smaller than the United States. The United States per capita has significant emissions, at least at that time, or in fact for many years up to that point. We can also look at the data from the point of view of emissions per GDP. That's another point of view that's in this data that you can look at. So clicking to the next chapter shows that. And then we get to the interesting part of the story. So this is the sort of the introduction to the data. And now we can start to talk about what's going to be going on at the conference. And so from a GDP point of view, and this is the way the Chinese presented it, this is their proposal for what they want to have in terms of their emissions targets into the future. It's pointed that way. It looks like they're being very responsible, and they probably have a good point of view from a GDP point of view. But their GDP is growing, and everyone knows that, certainly at the time it was. And in terms of raw emissions, metric tons, this is their proposal. So significant increased impact on the atmosphere as a result. And this is the United States proposal. And so this little story, which is data-based, is also telling a story about what's likely to happen at that conference. And yeah, it was. It was a hugely controversial conference with these different points of view banging into each other. So that's it. And notice what they were doing is they were showing the data from different points of view and helping people understand the movement back and forth. And it's very, very effective and very powerful. Now, I'm going to show you an example of filtering on a story that was about Harvard Business School and is another gender equity story. And in particular, you can see here at the start view, first of all, you can see this visualization is literally embedded right in the story. The text is running around, the clicker's there, and it feels like it's just part of the story itself. And they start with a view that shows all the men and women professors at Harvard, and you can see the men are in blue and the women are in gold, and there are way more men than women. And what the focus of the visualization is about, will that change over time? And so when you start the story here, it's got the chapters at the top, and you can click forward, and then what they do now is filter down to just the men who have tenure at Harvard and put them on how many years they've been there. Amazingly interesting data. Notice that one individual has been there for 51 years. Now, I'd love to meet that guy. Then the next chapter brings in the women who have tenure, and there's a lady there who's been there for 42 years. I'd love to meet her. They've got to be very interesting people. The next chapter brings in all of the professors who don't have tenure. This is the male tenure pipeline. And you can see there's a huge stack of guys, some of whom have been there a long time. They're probably not going to get tenure, but the rest of them are potential for getting tenure. Then the final step in the story brings in the women. And here's the punchline of the story. The pipeline for the women is really small compared to the pipeline for men, so gender inequity in Harvard will continue into the future. It just has to, until they solve the problem of hiring more junior professors so that they can end up with more tenured professors. And so what you saw there is essentially every single one of those operations was just a simple filtering operation, but it was assembled together in a way to tell an effective story. So, and then I have one more example, which is really interesting, and I have to preface this one with a little bit of an explanation. This particular example is from Hans Rosling, who in my opinion is probably the greatest storyteller with data on the planet. And he's very famous for 2 TED Talks that he's given. And he talks about specifically the gap between rich and poor. This particular example that I'm showing you is from very early in his career. It was a Flash animation that you can find. I have a copy of it as well. You'll notice how ugly it looks. And this was done in Flash. Hans is a very refined storyteller with data. But this particular example is just really interesting to me as an academic, which is why I'm going to show it to you. I want to apologize about how ugly it is. I don't want you to think this is how you should make your stories look. But the technique shows that there's a lot of potential going forward for us to discover additional techniques for showing data. Down at the bottom is a standard clicker through. This particular story has a lot of chapters, and we're picking up a little piece in the middle, and it's a piece that shows drill down. This is the classic scatter plot that Hans shows, ugly but standard, where you have GDP across the horizontal and child survival on the vertical. Why those 2 data values? Because those were the data they could get out of the UN at the time to tell this story. And you can see what the circles represent are regions of the world. And you can see that there's basically a linear relationship between GDP and survival, which makes sense. So watch what he does. He starts with sub-Saharan Africa, and he takes the circle and breaks it apart. And then he's making his point, and he'll make it over and over again. In that region, there are rich and poor countries. In South Asia, same thing. Here's Afghanistan, and here's Sri Lanka. So even in these different regions, which we know are, some of them are disadvantaged and some of them are quite well off, there's this huge disparity in terms of economic power. So here you have Yemen and the United Arab Emirates, and he proceeds forward on this. This is a very interesting technique which you can do using Flash. You could probably do it using D3 as well. If you're a programmer, you can do this, in other words. But what we want to do is bring techniques like this to everyone so that everyone can use techniques like this to tell stories. So now I want to talk a little bit about exploring, using visualization to explore. And here, there's something interesting, which is actually most people don't expect data views to be places to explore. So one of the fundamental things that you need to do is help people to understand that they can be places to explore. And so, good, there's a video on this one. So here's a particular example. This is an example about jobless rate. The dark blue line is a trend over time for all men and women in the United States, where you can see that there's been an increased jobless rate over time. But it may be hard to see, but there are a lot of faint gray lines in here. We call this information scent. What we're doing is giving people the hint that there's other parts of this data that you can look at. And you'll quickly discover that when you bring the mouse over and start rolling it around. And you can see that there are lots of different segments, and the filters at the top could tell you what those specific segments are, some of which have radically different shapes to them. And when you click, you can get that radically different shape to see it. And so you can go around and explore. You know, if you're a white male, you can find out what you are, or whatever category you're in, whatever age group you're in, you can go find out what your jobless rate is. this use of lines like this is a form of information sent. And the other thing I want to point out to you is that this isn't a data story. There's no information arc here. This is a place to explore, but it's not a data story at all. Now I'm going to show you something that uses information sent that's also a data story. This was done by Amanda Cox at the New York Times, and I think it's one of the coolest vizzes that has been done recently. What she was looking at the time was the relationship between the US government's ability to predict the economy and what actually happened in the economy. So you have time on the horizontal, and then deficit or surplus on the vertical. And the dark blue line that you see here is what actually happened in the economy over time. So over this decade and a half, most of the time the United States government ran a deficit, except for a few years in the 1990s when it ran a surplus. And then over on the right side with the lighter blue line is the 2010 estimate and the 2011 proposal. So this is the government trying to predict what's going to happen with the economy. And so here at this point, they're trying to argue whether it's going to go up. So if I start the video, then we're going to click through the chapters of the story. And the first chapter is, oh, yes, it just took a moment for it to happen. We're going to play from the very beginning. And you can see the faint lines here show the government estimates for at each of those periods of time. We stop at 1995 and see what the estimate was. So it was flat, essentially. But the reality of it at that time was that we got a surplus during that time. So she's telling us the government doesn't do a very good job. And then we wind up to 2008, and here what we see is that they estimate a surplus, but they end up with a deficit. And then the story ends at the end with, okay, here's where we are now. What do you think? Which way is the government going to go? And the thing is this view is also interactive. So once you're done clicking through the story, and in fact, any time during the story, it's live and interactive, and you can go look at a particular estimate and sort of explore the data yourself. So this is an example of a visualization as a story arc, but also as a place where somebody from your audience can come and explore as well. So these are very, very powerful and very interesting techniques for finding, telling, and exploring stories. And given that I still have enough time, I'd like to try and put this to use using Tableau and sort of take you through a little sort of a demo of how one might go about doing this. And I have Tableau Desktop 8.2 running with our new Story Points feature. And I'm going to use the Kiva data that Francois demoed this morning to you when he connected to it. So this is data about Kiva loans. You can see on it, there's information about, each row is about a specific loan. So there's information about the borrower, including gender. There's loan type, and there's also location that's been joined in here. And down at the bottom are a bunch of quantitative measures. And I'm going to focus in particular on funded amount. And so the first step, of course, is to find a story in the data. And so let me drag out funded amount. And you can see here that, in this particular set of data, there's a over $350 million in loan funding. And so that sounds really cool. You can go explore around. Like if I drop gender here, interesting finding. 2/3 of those loans go to women, and 1/3 go to men. Don't know the details about that, but you could make a story out of that, and it would probably be pretty interesting. Or you can go look at loan sector. So this is one of the cool things about discovery with visualization, is I can very quickly change my point of view. And if I drop loan sector down here and click on the sort button, I can see very quickly here that the sector that gets the most loans is food, which makes a lot of sense to me. And I can keep changing my points of view. Let me switch to bar here. I can also pull out funded date and look at the data from that point of view. Here you'll notice it's automatically sorted for Kiva, where we have time on the horizontal, and you can see that Kiva has been growing over time. That in 2012, they did over $100 million worth of loans in that particular year. We can even, we can do cool things in Tableau. There's definite depth to the tool as well. If I bring out funded amount again, I can use a quick table calc here to create a running total. And I can also I can drop loan sector here on color. And you can see now, I can see the individual details for each year and each sector, and also still see the global growth here. This is starting to seem like a really interesting view that I might be able to tell a story with, but there's only one part of the Kiva story. I could also, if I were to clear, well, actually, let me make a new sheet. We could also go look at the country data. So you can drag out the country here and drop funded amount on the vertical, and you can see that the loans have been happening all over the world, and you can tell the story about that. So at this point, we're starting to get into the data. We've done a bunch of exploration. We're starting to get a sense of a story. What I already have done here is I built a slightly more polished versions of these views. So here's a dashboard that involves the first view where I've added a filter at the top and the color legend. And here's the map where I've added the color legend on the bottom. And so the key question is, how hard is it to actually tell a story using story points? And we worked really hard to try and make it really easy because we knew the feature could be used two ways. It could be used to tell a story with a story arc, or it could just be used to gather observations that you might want to share with your work group. So we wanted it to be really, really easy to tell stories. We didn't want you to have to manage lots of different copies of the dashboard to do it. So we built a new layer of technology that allows us to capture deltas. And so to tell a story, you can just go up to the new story main menu, and you're now in the storytelling mode. Now, all good stories need a title, which I've got on my cut buffer, so I don't have to type it in to bore you with that. And let me start with the time view, and let me show you how quickly you can tell a story in Tableau. So here's the first view. I think I'm going to start with a sort of a historical story. So I'll wind back to 2007 and say something like, Kiva started in 2004 and took off in 2007. Hard to type. So I can update that point. And so see here, I can just keep going forward. I can now make another point. I can wind it up to the present. I can save that as a new point and say, growth has been rapid since then. And I can even do things like, let's say, select food here and save that as a new point. And I can say, food is the largest sector. And then, I can go on to the location one. And here I can do drag and drop. I'm going to put it at the end, but I could put it anywhere or even replace a point that's there. And this fits in with the last bit. So growth has been worldwide. Do I have to fix it? Probably do. And then, of course, I can do something like zoom into, say, Peru here and select it and make a new point and say Peru has had the most loans. So there's a story. And I can put it into presentation mode, go back to the beginning. I can step through, look at the story, see if it's the story I like. And of course, so that's the telling part. And then, of course, here's the exploration part. This particular review, by the way, shows that our highlighting feature that we've had in Tableau for a really long time is a great way to do information sent. And of course, I'm in presentation mode, but I can still look at different parts of it and go around and explore. And if I publish this up to the web, you could do that as well. If you use visualization to find a story, to tell the story, and create a viz that can be explored, that will encourage somebody else to explore your story and find a new story that they can then tell, and then they can, you know, and can chain onward from that. And I have a famous Tableau Public story about that was based upon Wisconsin milk. And I know some of you in the room have heard this story before because Christian tells it very well. This particular Tableau Public story was published by an investigative journalist called Wisconsin Watch. And the particular story was about milk production. What you see in the green line here is the number of cows in Wisconsin, and they're very interested in milk in Wisconsin, lots of farms. The blue line is the milk per cow, and then the reporter was reporting an interesting conclusion, which is that the farmers have been you know, increasing their milk production even though there's been fewer cows. And so this story was published, and it was noticed by Mark Perry, who's an economist. And of course, economists have their own point of view. And so he took that story, downloaded it, and added some data to it. It's very common, by the way. And the data was the price data. And so in Mark's version of the story, he added the red line that you see here, which is the price per hundredweight of the milk production. So not only is there more milk, but the milk is cheaper for the individuals. And then he blogged about all that. So that's an example of of the chain that can happen when you use a new medium like visualization and do effective storytelling with it. And so I want to encourage all of you to tell your own story, and I want to make the point that the result will be a rich conversation that can happen between people, and that this will ultimately lead to increasing health in terms of our tree of knowledge, if you will. And so I wanted to thank you very much for your kind attention. So.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Jock Mackinlay. Thank you, Jock.
Thanks, man.